morning, everyone, and thank you all for being here. It's an amazing turnout today, so we're really excited to see all of your faces. For those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Cal Merrick, and I'm the Associate Director of Operations here at CO. I'm giggling because I see Jonathan's chat that said we couldn't finish the song. Perhaps we'll put it on as our outro at the end of the session, but I'm glad.
Oh, there'll be plenty of music today, Cal. Plenty of music.
Well, I'm glad to hear that the music selection is to folks' likings. Again, thank you all and welcome to today's Building Racial Consciousness workshop. This is the first of 4 series that will be brought to us today by the Dendros Group. So I'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves again to you all. This is a 4-part series that goes along with our system-wide efforts to build diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism in how we do our work. So this is a part of kind of how we're supporting you all in the system, our staff, with the goal of ultimately helping children and families. As a part of this 4-part series, what our goal is that each of you will experience as participants is a sense of personal growth and development around the issues of race. You will be experiencing some levels of discomfort, but that will kind of lead to a commitment and action for change. And so there'll also be an experience of sense of agency in disrupting kind of these racialized patterns that have been marginalizing communities and making it really difficult for us to achieve our goals around serving all families and all communities. And you'll also experience an increased courage and willingness to engage in these types of conversations with the goal of having a positive change and positive outcome. So that's what we hope that you all experience while you participate in these series. As a quick disclosure, these series will be recorded, but it will just be the content of the series. So the content that Jonathan and Anthony will be sharing with us will be recorded, and then we'll have those edited and then made available to be viewed at later times, or in the event that you miss one of the series, that you'll be able to go back and take a look at it and still engage in those contents. Now that that's out the way, please join me in welcoming Anthony and Jonathan from the Dendros Group, who will be facilitating today's workshop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cal. I appreciate you for getting us started and kind of setting the tone for today. I want to promise folks that music will get us in and out of our breakout sessions throughout the days, so you'll have a chance to hear some of the jams. I love to sit with music. It's a thing that centers me as a musician myself, and even my congregation for the church I pastor in Duluth. One of the things that we will do when we just meet for regular everyday meetings is we'll jam out for a while. It's a part of a centering practice of mine. So glad you are all here. We're going to get started. And before we go too much further, I want to remind folks that our series is building racial consciousness. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like throughout the day. But as we have these conversations over these next sessions we have together, there are some resources that I want to put onto your radar. There are 2 podcasts. One is Counter Stories, and one is Racial Reckoning, the Arc of Justice. Both of these are wonderful resources for folks to continue to be engaged in conversations. Counter Stories is a podcast by people of color, for people of color, and everyone else. Tagline is fun, but the main point of it is that it's a group of folks of color who represent multiple racial communities in Minnesota, having regular conversations about daily life experiences and perspectives that you may not get in your everyday news stream. The Racial Reckoning Project, the Arc of Justice, is a partnership between the Minnesota Humanities Center and the Amherst Public Radio stations, where they're engaging young journalists to go and capture the story of this moment in Minnesota. Both of those are wonderful resources to just continue deepening and broadening and getting perspectives that you may not have access to where you are, or you may not have on your radar. The last one is the Artsas Center for the African Diaspora. And the reason that I've centered this is that they're going to begin putting out some online resources for African storytelling, drumming, spoken word, things like that. That'll be accessible statewide. And so I wanted you to be able to stay tuned for some of the resources that may be accessible there and may be pertinent to some of the people that you serve. So just some resources on the front end, and we'll make sure to get those out to you so that you have access to them. You can Google search them, look them up online. They're wonderful resources for you. So who's in front of you today? I want to begin not by introducing myself, but to talk about my business partner and colleague who are just brilliant people in their own right. One of the reasons that I love collaborating and working with Jonathan is that Jonathan always has a knack for being able to zoom out and help see the world in their connections, right? What are the things that cause that shift with us? He always has some references, some knowledge that he pulls out. I have never walked away from a conversation with Jonathan not having much more to think about. I like to tell folks he kicks me into the gut bucket of existential crises sometimes in order to be better on the outset, but all in a good way, right? And so deepening consciousness is something that he lives for. He's worked in organizational change and culture change in organizations for many years, strategic development. He's a hypnotherapist. He's a foodie. So we were brothers in our stomachs, but also as well as our general outlook on life. We'd like to find the joy in the personhood in all of us, and it's a really powerful way that I love to connect with. Jonathan also has my back when I have gone through a day and have experienced some things and some hardships. Even when I've been out in community and have had somebody say something to me that is very inhuman, even on the times when I was in public transit and somebody calls me the N-word, and I've hit target and somebody has touched my hair who doesn't even know me, petting me, and the racial petting is something we'll talk about. On the days when I really encountered the real visceral racial experiences, I have somebody who I can come to and who will always be walking solidarity with me and just kind of help me get me back on track to walk in my brilliance. And so it's one of the reasons I love collaborating with Jonathan, and you're going to love working with Jonathan. So I'm going to kick it over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Anthony. And I get the honor of introducing Anthony. And so as my business partner and colleague and dear friend, I appreciate Anthony because he's so big-hearted, so intelligent, and able to help us see things differently, especially in the world where so much change is going on, and the racial reality in front of us is so significant. Anthony's passionate about his work and also about elevating the work of many people. And I truly appreciate his ministry of presence and how he brings his full self to all his work. One of the things I deeply appreciate also about Anthony is his joy of life, which is just that no matter what he encounters, no matter what he's going through, or no matter what we're witnessing in the world around us, there is still always an ability to find in the moment some joy, some sort of sustaining thing, which is different than happiness, but it is the focus on the larger arc, the larger perspective, and what unites and integrates all of us. Anthony has a BA in ethnic studies and brings to us a wealth of information and insight, and has spent his career and his life thinking about these conversations that we're going to have, and has really deepened my appreciation and understanding of the world around us and of how people make the world around us. He is the executive director of ArtsUs, also, which is the Center for the African Diaspora, which does art, wisdom, culture from the African diaspora. He's also clergy with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and as he mentioned, he pastors a church in Duluth. This is a new posting, and we are all very excited for him to be doing his good work up in Duluth. He has over 15 years of experience in race equity and conversations about race. And he's also the host of the Counter Stories podcast and the Bearing Witness podcasts. And he brings to many, many people around the country a wonderful perspective, and brings together other people to add their voices to thinking about these issues in our times. If I was stranded on a desert island, he would be one of the people that I would love to be with, if only for his skills as a conversationalist, as well as his skills as a cook, because I'm sure whatever we could find, we would make a tasty dish together. So I'm thrilled to be doing this work with him, and it's been a great journey so far. And I'm thrilled that the two of us will be spending this time with you all, exploring these topics around race. So I'll hand it back to Anthony, and we'll get going.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. And before I give it back to for context setting, a few housekeeping things. We will be engaged throughout the day in some breakout sessions. So be prepared we will go into small groups and small rooms for some of the for unpacking and chewing on some things, and for some of the things that we'll be doing today. When we come back in, as we go to breakout rooms and come back from breakout rooms, there will be music playing. So there won't be that awkward space of everybody just sitting in silence waiting for the next thing to happen. So we'll fill that space as we go. If you have to drop and come back in, when you're in your breakout rooms, Jonathan and I will remain in the main rooms, so that if anybody drops for any reason, we'll be able to get you right back into your breakout room, no problem. And then we will have one or two stretch breaks throughout the space today. And then those stretch breaks will have you do something that's mindfulness in nature. Diane Sorensen, I see your kitty joining you on the video, and I love it. We will be doing things that will interact with the community around you. So last housekeeping thing is, if there's a beverage, coffee, tea, if there's something that'll help this session, because I know these online sessions can, we try to make sure to have some good time, have some fun, break it up. But if there's something that you need to do that'll help you stay present and help you be more present, definitely make sure you do that, whether it's having your kitty come in and greet you and say, hey, you're not giving me attention right now, I understand. Whatever it is, because we want to make sure that we dive into some conversations that we may not have had before. And that's what today's about. If we're going to have conversations about race, and I'll talk about this more a little bit later, and how the intersections, the things that we may not see, those are some powerful and can be some tender spaces. And so we want you to make sure that you take care of yourself throughout those conversations as we grow those muscles. So with that, I'm gonna kick it back to Jonathan, who's gonna start us off with some perspective pieces, and then I'm gonna contextualize what we mean when we talk about race.
Very good, thank you. Probably by now you've heard about the parable of the blind man and the elephant. So this is very, very old parable. We can trace it back to Buddhist roots several thousand years ago, possibly, if not later even. Just the idea that if we are trying to consider and trying to understand the elephant, it does us well to understand others' perspectives on what the elephant is. And so, as you may recall from the story, there's one blind man who touches the trunk of the elephant and understands that the elephant is like a tree. And there's another who touches the ear of the elephant and understands that the elephant is like a fan. And another who touches the tail and thinks of it as a snake. And another who touches the elephant and thinks of it as a I think the one who's touching the trunk or the leg thinks of it as a tree trunk. And so independently, we have our own little piece of reality and our own perspective on things, and we can communicate and share our perspectives to, hopefully, to the best of our ability, to describe what's actually in front of us. And we'll be doing a lot of work describing what we see from our perspective and honoring each other's perspectives as we go through the process, as we go through the conversations that we need. So we're going to talk throughout the time, the 4 sessions, we're going to talk a lot about our own perspective, and then we're going to extend that with additional perspectives from other people. And we'll also be covering a lot of stories that we don't know, or stories that only some of us know, and extending our understanding and our imagination and our capacity to understand the elephant of race and racism in our world in different ways that will hopefully liberate us into a new way of being and a new way of exploring and working in the world. So let's talk about racial, racism, and racist. I think these are key terms to understand and how we move.
So thank you, Jonathan. So one of the things that often happens in racial discourse, and I have been a part of racial discourse in South Africa with the Institute for Democracy at the 10-year anniversary of the end of apartheid. I have been on the ground at Ferguson. I have been on the ground at Standing Rock, working with communities. From a church capacity, I've been in communities across the country. And one of the things that we often see is that our racial discourse is dysfunctional. What do I mean by that? I mean, there's a whole lot of history and things that we talk about and don't talk about. And we never actually get to the essence of how that experience happens on a daily basis on a broad scale. And so oftentimes when we get into racial discourse conversations, we rush immediately to racist, right, in our conversation. That's the first thing that comes in. And we understand our history and why that may be the case, because our racial past has been very violent, has been very egregious, and we have agreed kind of generally nationally that it's not cool to be so, right? However, in our response to that, we can miss some important steps before we get there. And the iceberg pictures here because, and it's designed to mirror these 4 R's, because oftentimes we rush to racism, system and structures, and racist mental models, right? Without talking about where is race present and what is the experience of race. If we rush to the bottom of the iceberg, if anybody's familiar with Peter Senge's work, the pressure is higher, the stakes is higher, and it's a zone that is deep, right? But we need to spend some time, in my belief, talking about where do we see or not see race show up, and what is the experience of that. When Jonathan and I walk through the world, we may or may not be aware of how we each experience race differently. And those are essential pieces in the conversation if we're going to understand how structures are built that give us the outcomes that we see on a daily basis. And so if we rush to racist and we don't spend time understanding the experience, then really trying to get folks to understand wherever they come into the conversation, the nuance of how that gets to be where it is, we lose an important piece of the puzzle. We lose important pieces of the elephant that need to be on the table. So what I'm offering to us today and for our next sessions is that we're going to spend in these first 2 sessions a lot of time on these first 2 R's, the presence of race and the experience of race in our personal experiences. Okay. And I want us to give ourselves permission to spend some time in that place to really understand. Because if we try to get into the deeper structural things that are beyond our making, we have duties and we have responsibilities to it. But if we're truly going to understand those structures, we need to understand the experiences that undergird them. So that's what I'm trying to get us to do. How can we spend some time talking about our racialized experiences? Because they're different for all of us. So this is the nuance. The nuance is the key. I'm trying to complicate the conversation and narratives because unfortunately we have oversimplified them to the point where we've lost how they play out on a daily basis so we can actually make sense of the world around us, okay? So in doing so, I wanna remind us that racialized mental models, experiences around race, they're gonna be present regardless of political views. There is healthy critique, no matter what your political ideology is. There are healthy critiques and healthy experiences that are important about our racialized experience. So it's not tied to a political view, even though political views have tried to take it and use it for its purposes. And so I want to detach us from that binary. I also want to detach us or get us to the point of understanding that it's present regardless of racialized identity, that all of us have racialized experiences that are important to understand and unpack in our racialized discourse. So it's not just something for people of color. It's not just a story for them to tell. And it's not just a story for white folks to tell. It's a story for all of us to tell because we have all been socialized in this racialized environment. So this idea that when we talk about race, there's those folks over there and then there's these folks over here. I want us to shift our perspective to say, what is all of our racialized experiences? Because I need to know just as much about the racialized experiences in an all-white community as I do in a community that's racially heterogeneous or mixed up. So it's present regardless of racial identity. And this is important for the Midwest. And so I'm gonna go ahead and stop my share so that you can see my face. Minnesota family. This is me talking to you directly. Minnesota family. These conversations, these challenges, these issues are present regardless of our intentions. All right. I just need the Midwest folks to look at me right in my eye for a second. All right. Because if you're like me, I've been socialized in Minnesota, and intent is the single biggest driver of anything that happens. I need us to hold this space for ourselves that even when it's unintentional, I can perpetuate racialized, systemically inequities. I'll give you an example just because, somebody got to go first. Just like nobody takes the last bar on the table when we have potlucks, right? Everybody in Minnesota, you're with me on that one, all right? We also got to get somebody who's going to go first, right? So I'll out-polite you by going first. Here we go. All right. I used to take students to go to Fort Snelling to learn about the Dred Scott case. Black history, if you was going to be in my space, we going, and you're going to learn about Dred Scott. Everybody's going to learn this history, right? And I'm a good storyteller, so I was like, everybody's going to have a good time. And then I realized that my native students when they came, there was something going on. And I couldn't put my finger on it. And I read it as them not being interested in Black history. So I'm going in about intersections and all that stuff. And it wasn't until a native elder who came along with me one time, because she heard about this wonderful trip that we were taking, pulled me aside and said, "You didn't say one, do you know where you are?" And I had to stop and go, wait, what do you mean? And then she begins to tell me the full story of the area. And she's Dakota. Her name is Ramona Kitto Stately. She's my auntie in the work. And she's one of the few people who could call me and say, "I need you to come over and do something right now." And before I can even think about saying no, I've already got my shoes on. Like, that's who she is to me now. She begins to tell me this beautiful story around the sacred creation story of the Dakota peoples, which is right there at the Bedote, the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. And then she begins to tell me about the largest concentration camp for Native Americans in the history of Minnesota that took place right there in the Bedote. And then she begins to tell me the history of the fort and what it meant for the control and the domination of Native folks in this area. And then she begins to retell me about the 1862 Dakota uprising and all the things that happened. And then this powerful thing happened where I realized that at the same time the women and children were shipped out of that concentration camp down the river was the same exact month and year and time frame that the first flotilla of Black refugees were coming to Minnesota, the Hickman flotilla that established the first longstanding Black community in Minnesota. They passed each other on the river. And so she said, this confluence, Minnesota's a state of confluence, but you're not talking about the confluence. And yet you're blaming students for feeling funny in the space. It blew my mind. In that space and in that experience, I realized that regardless of my intentions, I was still perpetuating some inequity in my own practice. So if we can get out of this space that says this can happen regardless of our intention or malice, it allows us to be in a space of, I don't know what I don't know. And then I'm open to receive the new knowledge and experiences from the beautiful people around me. I am inviting you today to join us in that space of understanding that regardless of all of these views, regardless of your identities and regardless of your intention, we can still perpetuate racialized patterns. And when we step out of that and can look at that, we can do some beautiful things to interrupt patterns that may be easy or may be complicated, but we're in a space to interrupt them. And that's why we have these 4 guideposts. Our 4 sessions are going to start today with talking about you. So again, Minnesota folks, talking directly to you, I'm giving you permission to be completely self-centered today, to focus on you, right? And I don't mean you by proxy of your family or any of this stuff. I'm talking about you, the people right here. You are the most important people in this session today. How are we raised to view and engage racially? I was raised with certain conversations that were very different than what Jonathan was talking about when he was growing up. I say that because we've talked about this. Or that may be different from friends of ours who live in different places. And so we got to get on the same page of how we've been socialized around race so that we can have some common language. The next session we'll dive into history. The third one will take our new lens and new consciousness and say, let's look at the place around us and see what patterns we can see and touch and feel. And then our 4th session is going to be, how do we interrupt the patterns that we think need to be interrupted, right? Some may be easy tweaks, right? I can easily shift my trip to Fort Snelling to be inclusive of the many different stories that are there. That's an easy adjustment to make with the new knowledge that I have, right? And I can get to work to doing that. But there may be some deeper ones that we have to have more systemic responses to, and we're going to talk about that in our fourth session. So that is the layout as we go through today. And Jonathan, I apologize. I got on a roll, and I know you wanted to jump in there on the mental model side, but that story just came out of me, and I couldn't resist. So I'm loquacious, but I'll try to be cogently so. So that's the roadmap for our sessions today. And so I'm gonna kick it back to Jonathan, and we can start getting into some common language.
All right. One of the really critical things to do in having conversations that are difficult is to really understand the meaning of the words we use and therefore the mental models that we bring to it. When we don't live with some mental hygiene, things get really messy and upsetting and difficult to navigate very quickly. So I'm going to introduce these three terms and how we use them. And so our language, our structures, and our norms and our values are all socially constructed. And then we as the people make them up, and words change also over time. The meanings of words change over time. So we want to look at these three words with a critical eye and make sure that when we're using them, we have some shared understanding of them. So nationality is the first one. This is the citizenship or country of origin. We think about the corner of the globe, what's on your passport. These are human-made boundaries. Sometimes those boundaries are geographic, they're political, or they're social. My family, my last name is Polish, it's Budzki. Where people would say I'm from is Poland. However, actually my grandparents, my great-great-grandparents immigrated from a place in Europe that wasn't Poland at the time. Poland is a construct of the 20th century. It did not exist when my great-great-grandparents immigrated. So we want to think of nationality as a mark of geographic location. And so then ethnicity is the other construct that we want to understand. This is culture. What would you say is your ethnicity? And it gets more complicated here. It starts to touch a variety of different concepts that we attach our identity to. Some of the elements that might go into this could be things like nationality again, right? Heritage, family, language, art, food, values, etc. These are all things that can be understood as part of our culture, our ethnicity. And no matter what elements you include in your definition of your ethnicity, it will likely have to do with some sort of culture tied to a group or groups of people. And so then what about race? This is really important because unlike the other terms where you're more commonly the one who gets to define it from the inside out, race is often based on outside perceptions of you. And so even if you identify differently, there are perceived racial groups that have a complicated history. So it's very messy, and we often conflate these terms. And so we want to be clear in what we as facilitators mean when we use these terms. When we refer to nationality, it will be because we are referring to country of origin or citizenship. And we rarely use this term because most of our conversations is about experiences in the United States. And when we refer to ethnicity, we are speaking about culture, a culture, Midwest culture, Lutheran culture, whatever it is. And when we say race, we are talking generally about skin color categories that we as a society have placed people into. We have sorted people into these categories based on the color of their skin, and it's connected to our history as a country. So let's talk a little bit about a critically important story that has so many different nuances to it.
Thank you, Jonathan. You know, I always start, and I'm coming to you from, oh man, I get to say this for once. So I'm actually coming to you from Dobbs Ferry, New York, right, north of the cities. I was doing some work out here, and I'm joining you from that space. And so I get to be in the place where this next story comes to. I get really excited about history, so just know that. Tell me to slow down, ask any questions in the chat. We are monitoring the chat, and I want to make sure that you can do some reactions there. So let me just start with practicing there for a second. When you look at those terms, nationality, ethnicity, and race, have any of you ever been in a situation where somebody has either asked you or asked somebody else, what's your nationality? And they, and somebody says, oh, I'm from the US, I'm from the United States. And then they go, oh no, but wait, what? And we realize that the question that I just asked you isn't really the question I was trying to get at. Has anybody ever experienced that or seen that happen before? Where we start using those terms, what's your nationality? Oh, what I'm really trying to get at is your ethnicity. Or what's your ethnicity? I'm really trying to get a sense of how do you identify racially? And when we conflate those things, we get into some awkward moments. I'm going to show a video when we dive into our history dive by a filmmaker named Ken Tanaka, which dives into some of this and it kind of flips it on its head. But I want to ask this question for you, and you can throw it in the chat or you can raise your hand, use the raise hand feature, and we can have folks weigh in. Where have you seen people conflate these terms? Where have you seen it? The grocery store, church conversations? Go ahead and put it into the chat, or you can raise your hand and just shout it out. But where have you seen folks conflate, meaning use these interchangeably to mean something else? Can you think about where you were, what the context might have been? Go ahead and throw it into the chat. I just want to do a check-in with you all. Okay. Asian grocery store, church, work. Okay. People always ask me that, usually during my home visits. Childcare, school, ECE classes, school systems. And understand that these are social constructions, and we socially construct these. We make them up. People make this stuff up. So it's messy, it's flimsy, and sometimes nationality, the border crosses you. Has anybody ever seen that movie, The Terminal, with Tom Hanks? Very interesting story where he flies into New York and gets stuck in an international terminal because they won't let him leave because his country is in flux and they're no longer recognized as a citizen. He has no place of origin in his passport. Karen said in a getting to know you form, a family answered US when asked, what culture do you celebrate? Us. Oh, is it us or US, Karen? That's funny. Was it us?
Still muted. No, US.
Oh, US. Okay. Getting to know you. What culture do you celebrate? I celebrate us. I love that. I'm gonna make that T-shirt. We're gonna make a lot of money.
Yeah, right. No, it was way back, not that meaning.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, on vacation, they always say, you're from Canada. I can hear the accent. Is it because of the Midwest accent? So yes, we interchange these things. We want to be clear what we mean, but we also socially construct the stories that we're born with. I need a brave soul who can tell me the story of this monument. Who can raise their hand and tell me the story of this monument? It doesn't have to be a verbal story. This is not History Day. This is not AP US History exam. Just generally, just a couple of points. Who's willing to jump in and be a brave soul and tell us a brief history of the Statue of Liberty? I'm gonna use teacher wait time on this one because I really want somebody else's voice to come in.
France gave it to us because they wanted us to have it.
Thank you. Here's the beauty of social constructions. Since we make them up, we can only go as much as we've been given, right? And so I want to also check us out of this idea of right and wrong. Look, we've all been socialized differently. And so if we can hold that in, then we can just say, here's what I brought to the table. Here's what I got. The cool thing about a potluck is everybody's going to eat, except for the one dish that everybody avoids because nobody has the heart to say it doesn't taste very good. But other than that, most of us can be rest assured we can eat together. Gift from France, late 1800s. Those are all pieces of the story. Absolutely. Here's the kiki haha of this story. So if you go to the National Parks website, you can go look at what the state State Park Service does, and they'll tell you the story about the Statue of Liberty. Late 1800s, after the Civil War, some French abolitionists in conversations with other abolitionists said, we want to devise this national gift between our countries, and we want to signify that you have ceased being a slaveholding society. And they even engaged the designer Bertholdi to design the statue, and it was going to have the light of freedom in one hand and broken chains in the left hand. to signify that we're no longer a slaveholding society. Well, after the Civil War, and this is after Reconstruction, so this is after the period where there were soldiers protecting freed slaves and freed captives in the South and trying to establish order. This is when those soldiers have been pulled out, and you have things like at this time things like the Ku Klux Klan was born. Terror raids were beginning to happen to reassert what will eventually become Jim Crow rule in the South. So during this time, everything was about reconciliation between the communities because we just fought this bloody war. So nobody wanted to have a big giant monument, not nobody, but a lot of people in the country just weren't feeling a big monument that would highlight and put our national shame on display. And so we said, no, we won't put the broken chains in there. Well, Bertoldi, the designer, he said, well, then I'm not going to design it for you. So we almost had this huge diplomatic incident. Laboulaye, the French abolitionist in his community of folks, they actually had to crowdsource the funding for the Statue of Liberty. It's our first crowdsourced monument in American history. And he had to raise money from all these different places, and they had to compromise on the design. They had to appease Bertoldi, who said the chains need to be in there, and they had to get it made and accepted by our community here. And so Statue of Liberty is made. Do you see the chains? Well, if you get in a zoom telephoto lens by the feet of Lady Liberty hidden by the garments, you will see the chains. And so the Statue of Liberty becomes a very important symbol for America, not for the immigration story that it becomes about later, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. But I think it's a great monument because it actually is a good metaphor for how we treat racial discourse and racialized discussions. We really only like to have them when we're forced to have them by tripping over them, or when we pull back the veil, instead of making it something that's front and center, and so we can unpack it. So that's what I'm going to invite us to do today. We're going to take a quick stretch break. So we're going to have a conversation that's about something called racial autobiography bookends, and I'll let Jonathan explain it when we get there. But the design or the purpose of those bookends is to begin to have us tackle this question: how were we socialized around race? I have a good friend who grew up in Grand Marais, Minnesota, and he talks about the first encounter interracially he truly had with communities that were different than his own racially was when he went to the University of Minnesota. And he felt ill-equipped to engage across the many different areas that he had because of his socialization growing up. And he had a huge learning curve in that experience. Likewise, some of the friends that he met at the University of Minnesota grew up in spaces that were very racially and ethnically and culturally and socioeconomically diverse. And so when some of those friends would go back home with him to visit, they were in a little bit of a culture shock because it was the first time they've been in a situation where it's only been one particular group. And so there's these different things that they bring to the table in terms of socialization. If we're going to get to a conversation about race, we have to start talking about what pieces of the story, what pieces of the experience have we gotten growing up? And let's start there. Oftentimes we try to start way into a space where somebody hasn't ever had that experience. And so why would we expect them to be a PhD in that experience? So I want us to, as we have our conversations, think about some things to be mindful. So as we begin to share our stories, you'll get some time to craft your stories, and you get some time to share. But what I want you to think about is being curious about other people's perspectives. What I heard you say was, tell me more about. These are really good phrases and tools to use to really unpack and get centered on somebody else's perspective. So I want to offer those to you. All right. And I'm going to skip the next tool because I think I'm going to use it more. Jonathan, I'm going to use the other tool for when we get to our next session. So I'm going to come straight to you, but I really want us to think about using tools that lead with curiosity. That's going to really help us when we get into our breakout sessions. Tell me what I heard you. I heard you say this. Did I get that right? Did I understand that right? How many times do we stop and we go, oh, I get what you're saying, and you keep moving in the conversation without stopping to check and make sure? I did this with Jonathan earlier. He said something earlier today, and instead of stopping to say, do I understand that right? I immediately jumped into the next part of the conversation. So these are ways to slow us down and be a little bit more mindful, right? The last thing I want to say is there could be some shared agreements that we're going to make together in our next session. but we want to offer these to you for today. And that is when you get into your conversations about your racial autobiography bookends, and you'll know what that means in a second. I want us to think about, how can you speak your truth? We want to hear from everybody. This is why we have our breakout sessions no more than 3 to 4 people, because your experience is a vital, important piece to shared understanding, right? If you can tell me how you've been socialized racially, and I can get some understanding about that, imagine how much more I'm able to meet somebody else who has a very similar socialization to you when I get into conversations with them. So it's beautiful gifts that we give each other, but we can't give those gifts if we stay quiet. So we want to make sure that everybody speaks up, right? And speaks to their own experience, not somebody else's. This is very important. We often will talk about somebody else. How many times have we gotten into a conversation and say, oh, I can understand what you experience, and I immediately start talking about somebody else. I'm giving you permission to be completely self-centered. Speak your truth. Use those I statements, those personal statements. Also, some things may get uncomfortable. That's okay. We have to experience some discomfort so that we know where the areas are that we want to work on and continue to unpack, right? We have to be willing to experience some discomfort and then stay at the table even through that discomfort. And lastly, this one's easy. We're not going to solve the entire world's problems today. So let it go. Give yourself permission to just let that go. We'll do as much as we can with who we have and what we have here. And this is important because we're going to keep meeting. So we don't have to solve it all today because we know we'll see each other again. All right. Those are some agreements that we want to offer to you as we go into our first breakout session. All right. So Jonathan, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Anthony. So it's a very simple exercise on the surface, but it can lead to great insight and great depths of conversation. First of all, as Anthony proposed, go around the breakout room and give your five-word story about the orange thing you found, or for those of you who found a ray of sunshine or went outside, give your 5-word story too. And then we want you to share with one another, first of all, your earliest memory of race or racism. And then secondly, the other bookend would be, what is your most recent memory of race or racism? So share your bookends, and then, as Anthony said, practice being mindful in your conversations. Be genuinely curious and focus on listening to your colleagues, using phrases like what I heard you say is, tell me more about, and just have a great time understanding what your colleagues are talking about and exploring it.
Some of all of these things. Oh, thanks, Cal. In your conversations in your breakout rooms, some of you may have encountered some or all of these items. There may have been, you may have been socialized around race by family. There may have been covert things that are just, somebody says, hey, we can talk about this here, but you can't talk about this in public. There may have been overt things where somebody was very clear, had a very clear racialized view about another group. There are rural experiences. Some of you may have experienced things in the United States, in Central America, South America. They're old. Some of you may have church experiences. They're negative, positive. There can be games. Some of them are normalized. All of these things may have come up in your conversations. You may have also encountered some phrases. Now, these come from my family. This is another gift from myself to you all. My family was not exempt from real awkward and differing racialized experiences. So I have people in my family who said, just don't say anything about race. If I don't say anything, then I won't mess up. So we're just not going to talk about it. Or if something racial comes up, we don't talk like that. And a lot of it in my family was from folks who were saying, we're trying to not be and say those old horrible things that we wanted to say. However, it also meant that we weren't getting an education about some of the things that are out there and being said in the various communities. I have folks in my family who say, why does race matter? Right? Why do you keep bringing race into it? Why do you keep talking about it? It doesn't matter. At the same time, they'll be at the dinner table saying, here's my racialized experience that I just had, or here's how I didn't get this job because of this racially systemic thing. And I always will come back and be confused because, wait, you just said race doesn't matter, but then you keep coming home with these stories of racial terror, racial trauma, and racial experiences. How does that gel? And so there is this dissonance, even in my household. I always get various degrees of we're all human. You keep bringing race into the picture. We're all human. We're all the same. And so stop talking about race. We're all the same. And again, I keep coming to the table and saying, if that's true, then why are so many of us treated so differently? And nobody had an answer. Nobody is a color may have been something that you heard. This one comes from my family. If she can't use your comb, don't bring her home. Here's some racial baggage from my family to yours. And that basically, because in many parts of my family, it was a rule that you could feel free to play around with folks from many different racial backgrounds. But if you're going to bring somebody home, she better be from us. She better be a part of our culture. And so even myself, growing up in a Black household, had a saying, and I was rooted for very different reasons, right? Some of the reasons that there was this prohibition on dating outside of my racial experience is because of negative experiences before, including one of the lynchings that I talked about that occurred because of interracial dating. So the origin may be very different, but the impetus and the implementation was very similar. Don't bring nobody from outside our race group home. And I got this growing up all the time. And even when I had my mom's best friends were white, I called them Auntie Titi and Auntie Lily. We even gave them Black nicknames, and they were white as part of our family space. And so just to show the complication of this weird socialization that we have. And then of course, I grew up with varying degrees of I'll have to work twice as hard for the same job. These are the same people who are saying, we're all human, we don't see color, why do you keep bringing race in here? But at the same time, out of the same people's mouths where if she can't use your comb, don't bring her home, racial reference, and you're gonna have to work twice as hard because of the racial systemic racism in our society. So in one household, I got all of these messages. I guarantee that you got varying degrees of confusing messages growing up and had to navigate all those. And we are all socialized around these things. And so what I'd like to offer for you is an invitation to say, some of us may have grown up in spaces that are colorblind. So if we're meeting out, there are places for us to be colorblind. Our justice needs to be, in some cases, colorblind. If I'm taking into account race in certain areas where there's not a history involved in it, it's just purely talking about skin color category, there are some times where I need to operate without that context. There's also a lot of ways in which that gets us into problems, because it also sets me up not to see important nuance. We need to be aware of some of the differences that are at play, because some of the things that we do require us to be aware that the world doesn't work the same for everybody, that there are experiences that complicate scenarios differently. And my awareness can help understand that. But I want to invite us to something even deeper than that, and that is consciousness. To not just be aware of racial nuances, but understand the patterns, the impacts, and to really work towards being more conscious of what all the little ins and outs of that are. We can seem to do this in other intersections, but when we get to race, we tend not to have as much staying power for the complications and nuance as we do for other experiences. And so I offer that to you to say, as we move to deeper consciousness, that's the goal of these sessions. How can we become more aware of how we've been socialized, and what are the things, the little fault lines underneath the radar that are bugging us over and over? Jonathan, you were about to jump in?
Nope, all good. I'm ready. I'm ready for the next part. Go for it.
Gotcha. So as we begin to unpack our socialization, one of the things that we need to do is take a look at ourselves and say, what are the various identity layers that come into us? And so Jonathan's going to take us through an activity to start really getting clear about who we are and who's in the room.
Very good. Thanks, Anthony. So you can grab a piece of scratch paper to do this on. We're going to ask you to create an identity pyramid. So as we think about what's gone into how we view the world racially, it's important for us to think about our own identity. And it's from there that we take action and we kind of understand and interpret our various experiences. So if we're going to engage more deeply around in the world, and especially around conversations around race, it's helpful to understand and to know what our most foundational lenses are, the ways that we look at the world, and how they connect together. So that we can understand more about our decisions and our interactions and our experiences. So we want you to take some time to think about your foundational identity. That's the layers you carry around, the lenses you carry around, rather. And so what we'd like you to think about is what are the ways you identify? So as a worker, as a parent, as a writer, a musician, an artist, an auntie, an uncle, an elder, a young person, whatever it is, and take as many, make a list of as many of things as you can imagine right now. And then what we'd like you to do is, once you have your list about yourself, think about what's most foundational, what would go on the bottom of your triangle here. And then that foundational layer really informs really all the other layers. And so we want you to start with the foundational layer. What's the foundational identity you have? And then move up from there and sort into your pyramid several of those different ways of seeing the world, but your identities. And we'll give you an example of our pyramid in a second so you can see what we're asking for. This is not all of who you are. It's not the most complex arrangement of your identities, because identities evolve and change over time, and their relationships to one another are impacted by the context you're living in. So we just want to take kind of the first blush way of thinking about your foundational ways of seeing the world and your identities in it. So try to play with your pyramid, and also understand that the foundational level feeds the next layer, which feeds the next layer, which feeds the next layer. So we're going to have you do this now, and you're going to go into breakout rooms and discuss your pyramids. And Anthony, how are you doing on time? How much time do they have?
So we'll take a minute to, I'll play a song for you can start to generate your list. And then as soon as that song is over, we'll go in for 10 minutes into our breakout room so that you can share what's on your pyramid. And then we'll come back together and wrap up for the day.
Right.
So I'll let Michael Jackson give us some time to record our lists. And then as soon as that song is done, we'll open up the breakout rooms and send you.
Right. And so this is our invitation to more deeply explore interactions and intersections, and really understand something more about our consciousness and how we interact with the world. So there we are. Anthony, anything else?
Our identity layers often can present some really amazing stories, especially in terms of how we see the world. So Jonathan, do you want to talk a little bit about our pyramids, or what's on your pyramid, and we'll talk about the—
Sure. So let me just pull it up so I can see it better. Yeah, and so when we've done this exercise before, I'm the one on the right, and so my primary.
Oh, you should have made them guess. You should have made them guess who's whose.
Oh, it's a little hard to understand. So I have two sons. I have two young men as sons, and they are the world to me. And as I move in the world, I primarily think of myself as a father. I have a loving spouse named Yoshiko, and she is my love and joy. And I think a lot about our relationship and how it's impacted and impacts me in the world. Then I think of myself as a thinker, or somebody who approaches the world kind of through thought, through reflection. And then finally, I also think of myself as a business person. I have several businesses along with consulting and training that Anthony and I and our team do. I also have a therapy practice, and I also have a food business that grows and manufactures food. And so those things are near and dear to my heart, and I love doing them. So that's my identity pyramid.
And so for me, my foundational space, for the longest time, I had father first, very similar to Jonathan's, except when I thought about how I interact as a father, it is very much tied to the men who I grew up with in my life, my father, my uncles, this idea of, folks in Black communities growing up without fathers. I had several fathers because we're a collectivist in the communal community where I grew up in. And so I never understood that I never had that experience. And so, but how I showed up as a father was very much the same. So there's some father universals, right? I think many dads can think to times where they sent their kids, called their kids all the way downstairs from upstairs to get them a remote that's 2 feet away. There's some universal fatherhood experiences that we all have to account for at some point in our lives. But there are other things that were very unique and specific to Black community and history that had to do with how I parent as a father myself. And so I realized that my Black cultural identity was foundational to my understanding of how to be as a father, which informed my clergy and faith exercise, because it was through my father as a church musician that I got introduced to both faith and music and the experience of being able to worship together in our particular faith tradition. So you can see how they all feed into each other. Now, the beautiful part about knowing what's on Jonathan's and knowing what's on mine, and we know we can go many layers up and many layers down. So this is just a snapshot, right? But being able to know that Father is on both of ours, when we talk about how even when we do calendaring, we know without even saying it that when we see kids or something with our kids on each other's calendar, that's a no-go zone. Like that is precious, sacred time. And I'm not even going to raise questions about that unless I absolutely emergently have to, because I understand what's part of the foundational layer space. And so I can know that and ask some questions about that, have some understanding there. As a thinker would be a deeper on there, but knowing that thinker's on Jonathan's space, I know that I can engage him in that way. And that's a space where he runs, 100 miles an hour. And so it becomes a very important connecting point. I also am keenly aware that there are things on mine that aren't on his pyramid, and I can ask questions about why that is. Here's my wondering for you, and this one is just something for you to think about between now and next session. What are the implications? If you look at my pyramid, you look at Jonathan's pyramid, where does race show up? You see on mine, it's a foundational layer. On yours, and again, we want to reiterate, your pyramid is your pyramid. Can't nobody else tell you what to put on your pyramid. You don't change it. Don't do the reactive corrective thing. I'm not telling you that you have to have race in your pyramid. What I'm saying is, what are the implications if we realize that some of our important intersections that we engage in, whether it's gender, sexual identity, race, or any of those things, faith, if it's not on my pyramid, if it's not something that's on my lens in a real present way, day to day, what are the implications of that? What can be the implications of that? And it doesn't mean good or bad, positive or negative. It's all on there, but it just invites us to ask some questions and wonderings. Could it be connected to our socialization? Is it because it is there and I may not necessarily notice it? Or is it something that I don't often pay attention to? And I have an invitation to now say, let me start looking around and see where this shows up. Let me see if I ask them, look at some of those questions, how we can deepen my consciousness and understanding. And so I want us to keep this in mind, that as we think about our lens, when we go into our next session and we dive into the history that we may or may not have gotten growing up, and some of the underlying and below the line histories there, what are ways in which our socialization and our lenses that we see day to day, what are some ways in which those lenses might be preventing us from being able to see some of these deeper, more nuanced stories and experiences? And so again, we want to treat it as an invitation. You are enough. You are absolutely enough. And by connecting all the things in our different pyramids, we now start to make connections that surface consciousness. The fact that Jonathan is a thinker and a business person helps influence my experience and add that collective benefit and brilliance to how I see the world, and vice versa. There are ways in which we can do that and use our collective experience to do that. Does that make sense? I want to thank you for your participation today. And we're going to close just to remind you all that the next time we meet is Thursday, October 28th. All right. From 9:30 to 11:30, it's the same link.